RWBY, perhaps one of the most divisive web series ever created. Beginning its life as a Rooster Teeth original in 2013, RWBY was the brainchild of the late Monty Oum, known for his outstanding skills in animation and fight choreography. May he rest in peace. Though the series was much beloved at the time of its release, time and fans alike have been less than kind to RWBY over the years, despite significant improvements to the show's staff, budget, and animation quality. Now, this is not meant to be a retrospective of RWBY itself, as I'm sure you might have guessed from the title. Plenty of others have done full, comprehensive breakdowns and retrospectives of this series already. I've seen and heard hundreds of complaints about RWBY's story over the years, with some saying the plot fell apart after Monty's death, and the new writers veered away from his original vision, to others claiming the script was never particularly great to begin with, and the show's main appeal was always the action scenes. Personally, however, I believe the truth is actually somewhere in the middle, and many of the issues with RWBY's later seasons can be traced back to one character in particular, Cinder Fall. Cinder has been a part of RWBY's story since the very first episode. We're first introduced to her as a shadowy figure working in conjunction with the notorious crime boss, Roman Torchwick. We didn't know anything about her, not even her name or face, but she very quickly established herself as a formidable opponent. The fact that Roman immediately asks for her aid when a professional huntress tries to prevent their escape makes it abundantly clear that this mystery woman is not someone to be taken lightly, and her back and forth with Glinda only reinforces that opinion. The last shot we see of her in the episode is Cinder casually blocking RWBY's bullets with her fingers, solidifying that this is a villain well above the hired thugs and crime bosses introduced at the start. They were a threat our protagonist was blatantly capable of handling, but whoever this mystery woman might be, she's well out of RWBY's league, giving us a clear idea of what our protagonist should strive for. The next time we see Cinder isn't until the end of Volume 1, where she appears to have defeated Torchwick alongside her lackeys, allies. It wasn't clear at the time, but the way in which these three move, and Cinder's casual display of power, make it abundantly clear that she's part of something much bigger than anything our heroes face throughout Volume 1. Once again, this mysterious lady is setting herself up to be a significant opponent for the huntsmen and huntresses of Beacon, and many fans at the time thought that she would become the true antagonist of the show. Volumes 2 and 3 only further reinforce that idea, for the most part. We see more of Cinder and her teammates, Emerald and Mercury, as they infiltrate Beacon and slowly set their plans into motion. Of course, we still don't know what those plans are at this point, but we get hints of it in Volume 2 when Ozpin and Pyrrha talk about the story of the 4 Maidens. These Maidens, each representing a season, were said to boast significant power, enough to potentially rival armies. It didn't take long for people to start putting the pieces together, especially when Cinder's last name is literally Fall. She was, or at least had some connection to, one of these maidens. However, we still didn't understand what Cinder was actually after, why she was stealing dust, allying with the White Fang, or infiltrating Beacon. That being said, we did have the faintest hint of what her motivation might be, thanks to Volume 2's ending. RWBY's soundtrack has always been a banger, and its music arguably does a lot of heavy lifting in terms of character building. Red Like Roses Part 2 is all about RWBY's grief over losing her mother. Mirror Mirror shows Weiss's internal struggles with her upbringing, and even the openings like This Will Be the Day and Time to Say Goodbye give a pretty clear indicator of the overall themes each volume is trying to tackle. To that end, the song that plays during Volume 2's credits, Sacrifice, seems to offer us a unique glimpse of the villain's true motivation. The world of RWBY is inhabited by monsters called the Creatures of Grimm, or just the Grimm for short. They are the oldest and most significant threat to the people of Remnant, desiring nothing more than destruction for destruction's sake. They're drawn to feelings of sadness, anger, and uncertainty, and they're the things that huntsman academies were built to fight. While the idea of a school for young heroes is hardly an original concept, the idea of training kids to be the first and last line of defense against these monsters is a little messed up when you stop and think about it. Sure, they sign up for it, but Ozpin's methods are a bit extreme, let's be real. It might be for the greater good, but come on. The entrance exam is literally being thrown into a monster-infested forest and told to fight for your life alongside several strangers. Sacrifice is a song directed toward Ozpin, a character who clearly knows and understands more about the world than he lets on. The lyrics are sung from the POV of someone who refuses to die for Ozpin's cause. At the time, a lot of fans concluded that this was likely Cinder's song, and that she wanted to stand against the society Ozpin was making, a society where kids are raised and trained to fight an unending wave of monsters, often dying for the greater good. This was an especially interesting direction to go in, given that RWBY's own mother died tragically for that very cause, and yet RWBY herself is still pursuing the heroic ideals that led to her mother's demise. Then Volume 3 rolls around and everything hits the fan, for better and for worse. To start, we get an episode dedicated to how Cinder met and recruited Emerald and Mercury onto her team, as well as how she got her maiden powers. This episode begins with a line from Cinder, more or less spelling out her motivation to us. I want to be feared. I want to be powerful. We will come back to this line in a bit, but it certainly takes Cinder's character in an interesting direction. Power can seem like a really shallow motivation for a character, and it often is. But the best villains who use this trope are those who have a reason for pursuing power. Often, they want to get stronger to prevent or escape some tragedy, only to lose themselves in pursuing power for power's sake. The rest of the episode shows us how Cinder got her team together, and stole the powers of the Fall Maiden using some kind of grim ritual. Side note here, am I the only one bothered by the fact that the Maidens, despite having clear seasonal themes, all have the exact same powers? Makes it seem kind of redundant when they can all just control any element they want, but we'll get back to that later. Anyway, Volume 3 continues on, and Cinder enacts her grand plan, the fall of Beacon Academy. She exposes Penny as an android, takes over Atlas's ships and robots, and draws a huge crowd of Grimm to all the chaos. The White Fang joins in on the assault, and true pandemonium ensues. During all of this, Cinder gives a grand speech that casts even further doubt on the Huntsman Academies, calling them out as power-hungry frauds who keep strict leashes on the public under the guise of protection. Though we still didn't know what led Cinder down this path, her goal was now blatantly clear. She wanted to tear down the Huntsman Academies and expose the likes of Ozpin and Ironwood as tyrants masquerading as protectors. Then we get to the end of the volume and everything I just said falls apart. Turns out, all of that was just a ploy so that Cinder could steal the rest of the Fall Maiden's power. Now, the final battle between her and Pyrrha is pretty great, if not tragic, but it's the end credits scene that really causes things to go downhill. As the volume draws to a close, we are introduced to a new antagonist, and the real mastermind behind everything, Salem. This is, in my opinion, perhaps the single biggest blunder of RWBY's story. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't hate Salem as an antagonist, but I think they introduced her too early. Salem's introduction does a lot of good and interesting things for the series, but it came at the cost of demoting Cinder to just another one of her lackeys. Cinder went from being the mysterious and cunning leader of the operation to just another pawn in the war between Salem and Ozpin, something that seriously diminishes the impact of her speech in Volume 3. Originally, we were led to believe that Cinder wanted the academies to fall because of her beef with Ozpin and the other headmasters. But really, Salem is the one who wants to tear down the world that her ex-husband built. She offered Cinder a place at her side in exchange for power, which Cinder accepted. Now, this doesn't immediately ruin Cinder's character, but it does diminish a lot of what we thought we understood about her at the time. The question now becomes, why does she want power? Unfortunately, that question wouldn't be answered until Volume 8. And before then, we discover that Cinder is actually even more pathetic than we originally thought. Remember the 4 maidens? You know, those who possess elemental power so great that Cinder threw an entire city into chaos to get it? Well, it turns out the maidens are actually just glorified keys whose main purpose is opening doors that grant access to relics with real immense power. Cinder was given the means to steal a maiden's magic purely so that she could open a door for Salem and hand off the magical item within. You want to be feared. You want to be powerful. You're not exactly managing either when you're readily submitting to Salem's whim like this. Maybe this could have been salvaged if Cinder was shown to have some intention of stealing a relic and betraying Salem, but unfortunately, she's loyal to and fearful of the witch, just like all of Salem's lackeys. Throughout Volume 5, they try to give Cinder back some of that menacing aura she had, but she just lacks the same impact now working under Salem that she had back when it seemed like she was an independent party. Her fight with Raven was pretty cool, but given the mess of Volume 5's plot as a whole, it doesn't really do much for her character. Anyway, I could go on and recap how else Cinder's character devolves over time, but I think you get the point by now. The one last point of note to make here is what happens in Volume 8, where we finally get Cinder's backstory, and the reason for her craving for power. She was a slave. That's it. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not a bad justification exactly. Hell, it's the same backstory as one of my personal favorite villain characters. Unfortunately, it really doesn't work here. If Cinder's desire for power comes from being a former slave, then the idea of becoming a literal tool for Salem should be even less appealing to her. Sure, Salem might treat her better on the surface, but she practically owns Cinder the moment Cinder becomes a maiden. If nothing else, this only reinforces the idea that Cinder should be striving in secret to overthrow Salem, plotting to take the relics for herself rather than just regain her mistress's favor. But, frankly, I still think Cinder shouldn't have been subservient to Salem in the first place. I genuinely believe that Cinder should have been the main antagonist of RWBY's entire first arc, and Salem could have been introduced as a villain later on. That's not to say that I believe the two have to be totally disconnected, though. Maybe Cinder learns about the secret war fought between the two immortals, Salem and Ozpin, and seeks to undermine both as a result of having been caught in the middle. We could say that Cinder is trying to gather all of the Maiden's powers for herself as a means of rivaling Salem's strength, while throwing back the curtain that Ozpin has tried so hard to maintain. Only after she's been beaten do the heroes learn about the true natures of Salem and Ozpin, as well as the origins of Remnant. Alternatively, you could have Cinder just be one of the Maidens from the start. To be honest, I still don't care for how the Maidens are handled. Even Crow points out how convoluted and ridiculous the rules are. A Maiden's power will transfer to the last person they think about as they die, if that person is female. Otherwise, it just goes to a completely random girl or woman somewhere in Remnant. I honestly feel like the powers should just be passed down through bloodline, and while we're at it, just make them element-themed. Summer gets fire, winter gets ice, fall gets wind, and spring can be earth or flora. We can still have Cinder using multiple elements, just say she stole them from the other maidens. It doesn't really matter how, so long as it's not because of Salem. Cinder deserves more than just being a glorified key to open a magic door. In conclusion, I believe that Cinder Fall could and should have been the first major antagonist of RWBY, and her team of what are essentially anarchists are fighting to expose the truth of Ozpin and Salem, albeit in a way that does more harm than good. Perhaps she can team up with the heroes later on to oppose the real threat, or maybe Salem is waiting for Cinder's fall to make her move, viewing the combined powers of the Maiden as a legitimate threat. Whatever the case, her handling in the show is, in my opinion, one of RWBY's biggest missteps. But what do you all think? Does Cinder work better as a leading antagonist or as a supporting role to the true villain? Leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I'll see you all next time.